It's Just Business with Steve Thomas and your host, Chris Larry.
Hello and welcome to another episode of It's Just Business on the Hogstye Network, the show where we look at the dollars and the cents of the sports, media, business, industrial complex found in some business park somewhere in unmarked USA. Steve, how you doing today?
I'm doing good. We're recording this the day before the kickoff of the NFL, the kickoff of the first Sunday of the NFL season. So, that's a good thing. I'm looking forward to seeing my Redskins play football here on Sunday. Notice I said Redskins.
Yeah, everyone noticed, Steve. No worry. You don't have to double call it out. Yeah, I am as well. And I just have to, I will, we never made terms, but I will say I will give the gentleman win to Steve, because we did have kickoff at whatever, 8:27 p.m. Eastern time on Thursday. So I did lose that bet. A bet I'm happy to lose, by the way. I was not rooting for there to be no game. So, I guess I win and lose at the same time. We'll see how the season goes. Again, rooting for everything to be normal, but I did want to acknowledge that I lost that bet.
Yeah, we never came to terms, and I understand. Now it makes me wish we had bet something fabulous now that I won. Of course, I'm also lucky that I was also willing to go to fans in the stands, which I would have lost, like full fans in the stands, which I would have lost that bet had we gone to those terms. So I was kind of lucky I didn't. Because that's what I usually do on bets. I usually go way overboard. Imagine that, me going overboard.
Well, we will find we'll find something new. But I'm a man, a gentleman of class, and a scholar. So I want to acknowledge when I lose.
Just send me some money.
All right, I'll send you some Hogstye crypto.
Yeah, that's going to be worth a lot. Trust me.
I'll send you 1 million of them.
Oh, thank you.
So yes, we did have kickoff. So yay! I found it was probably the most I enjoyed a sporting event in some time. That's probably just because of my love of football and my classic flame out of my Washington Capitals. So and I'm looking forward to Sunday.
Yeah, I boycotted the opening game, as I told you off the air. Because I'm a bit sick and tired of being preached at by athletes and by sports commentators. So that was just my form of protest. Hopefully I will not have to continue my protest. We'll see. We'll see how preachy it gets on Sunday.
I should have boycotted the second half because it was very boring.
Did you watch the whole thing?
I watched the whole thing, yeah. I had fantasy interests. Speaking of interests that are outside a rooting or of any sporting event, but it's specifically the NFL, really are entering an interesting time with the gambling on sports. We'll go into the deeper level, but probably the Flashpoint story, or maybe another example of how mainstream this is becoming, is that Michael Jordan, no stranger to a wager, has joined the board of FanDuel, right? Isn't that the site?
Well, DraftKings.
DraftKings, right. Michael Jordan, one of the most famous gamblers of all time, now in a position of control and power over one of these companies that is looking to, be at the top of the market now and legalize sports gambling.
Yeah, and it's not just that Michael Jordan, the athlete, is involved. It's that Michael Jordan, the owner of an NBA team, is involved, is what's more interesting. Yeah, Michael Jordan, famous gambler. It looks like, my guess is that he probably had a gambling problem back in the day at least, and he just could afford to have a problem, more or less. But him being involved in DraftKings is a sign that pro sports is really getting in bed very quickly with gambling. And we've seen it in other things, as you said. Other leagues are, I think the NFL has a sponsorship, now through one of those sites. I don't know. I don't care if you gamble. Gamble every penny if you want. It's none of my business. But I've always had a problem of a concern rather with the integrity of the game being questioned if there's too much gambling. So if you have a guy like Michael Jordan, who's the owner of the Charlotte Bobcat, are they the Hornets or the Bobcat? I never can remember. It's the Charlotte Hornets, right?
Bobcats.
Bobcats. Okay. If you have the owner of the Charlotte Bobcats involved in a gambling site, I mean, is he going to make moves to benefit his equity stake in DraftKings? Because that was part of the story, was that he had an equity stake in DraftKings as part of this. Is he going to make moves that benefit him financially to the detriment of the team? I mean, that's the whole question with it. And basically, the pro sports, meaning the NFL and the NBA in particular, have just decided that the money is worth it. That's what they've decided. They didn't really do anything to alleviate my or anybody's concerns about the integrity of the game. They just said, we're doing it anyway because there's just too much money involved. So, I mean, at some point it's going to get questioned, because don't forget, the NBA is the league that had corrupt refs. Somehow escaped that. At some point it's gonna come up. That's my problem with it. But in terms, if you want to gamble, gamble away. But the marriage has come fast and furious with the Supreme Court opinion as to gambling.
Just because we care about accuracy here at It's Just Business, it is actually the Charlotte Hornets.
Okay, Charlotte Hornets.
Yeah, this is, we've gone over this before, and we'll probably even hint at parts of this now. I have no problem with a lot of this. What I find interesting is the exact same thing. And the first thing, when I saw the story pop up, I was like, my first thought was, oh, he must have given up his ownership stake at some point that I just didn't pay attention to in the Charlotte Hornets. And then so I looked, no, he hasn't. I find that, I mean, yes, you can always baseline this to crass money play, and that obviously is probably what it is. But I did think it was eye-popping that they would allow the NBA, or any sports league for that matter, professional league, to have an owner have a stake. Now, I guess actually Ted Leonsis also has stake in gambling things, so I guess it's not even new. That really feels to me problematic. Not for any kind of moralistic reasons or any of that, or that
it's a conflict of interest is what
but
it is.
that to me, like, if you're gonna, it seems like if you're gonna have allowed this all to happen, that would have been one of your bedrock gates, right? That would have been one of your firewalls against, what could be problematic of this, fixing games, yada yada. So I am really pretty surprised that these leagues don't have some kind of conflict of interest rules clause that blocks especially owners from having stake in these enterprises.
Yeah, listen, it's the same old story, right? It's the theme of this show. Money always rules everything. At the end of the day, there's just too much money involved. I have little interest in the morality play of it. I'm not a big gambler personally, but I mean, you do you. I don't care whatsoever about it. And the truth of the matter is, it's probably fair for the federal government shouldn't be allowed to pick and choose states. That was always a big problem, kind of at a macro level. So I kind of get it. Um, you know, but morality aside, it's definitely a conflict of interest. It truly is. And Michael Jordan is not a regular NBA owner, okay? I mean, Michael Jordan, he was the liaison between the players and the owners in this NBA restart thing that happened a month ago now. He's I think the only African American owner in major pro sports right now, American pro sports right now. I don't think there's another one that I can think of. There's the Shad Khan, who's a minority, but he's not African American. So I think it's a big deal that Jordan is involved, and that the NBA didn't blink. Did not blink whatsoever, and they obviously approved it. They obviously know, and he's got an equity stake in the company. So I just think it's eventually ripe for problems. But it truly shows that the concerns that the NBA in particular had and the NFL had, they just flushed them straight down the toilet because they didn't do anything to alleviate the concerns. There's no extra protocols in place to ensure teams don't respond or don't act. They just said, screw it, we're throwing it in the trash can, period, in the name of money. Because there's nothing different that's in place to ensure that Michael Jordan does not make moves to benefit his equity stake in DraftKings. They just ignored it, and they've never ignored it before. And they're getting the Raiders in bed, with the city of Las Vegas, no qualms whatsoever about it. So it's just money rules everything. That's all it is.
Yeah, and Michael Jordan. The other reason or aspect of where Michael Jordan isn't your typical owner is I'm pretty sure he's got a pretty heavy hand into the on the court decision making of that team. I mean, he's probably. I don't think. I don't believe, and I just double checked. He is the official. Has any kind of general manager or any kind of front officey type of role. He's not named that, but I'm sure is part of basketball decision making for the Charlotte Hornets. So it's a little to me that's another reason it might be different than some business person that owns the team or whatever. It has credible people who run the basketball operations or whatever operations, what sport it is. This is somebody who's actually probably pretty heavily making decisions. What player, who player, what deals. So that's another layer of almost direct lever pulling.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. Because Michael Jordan is Michael Jordan. He's the only owner out there that can competently hoop with the players on the court, and he does. There have been stories about him being at practice and making decisions, and who's to say that he, doesn't sit somebody or start somebody in the name of DraftKings. Now the Charlotte, did we say the Hornets? Charlotte Hornets. The
Yeah.
Hornets have never been very good. Under him, he's not like he's making the correct decisions. But be that as it may, it's the interesting part of it to me is that all of a sudden nobody cares. Not as little as 2 years ago, it was a big problem. Gambling, sports, and particularly the NBA, when you had the referee Tim Donaghy, yeah, got in trouble for basically being in bed with a bunch of sleazy gambling people, and it sort of insinuated he was involved with shady characters and whatnot. Now all of a sudden, it's not a problem, not a problem whatsoever. It's just amazing to me how fast the issue went away. And not only now did the issue go away, but the NBA has basically sanctioned it now. With an owner involved, they're sanctioning gambling. It's one thing to say, okay, the federal government has alleviated the gambling restrictions, and so, you guys go do you and gamble on it. And it's another thing entirely for the NBA to jump into bed with them, in so little time. So there's nothing to do about it, I guess. But I just think it's going to be a problem at some point. That's all.
I really am shocked that they didn't come up with, as you said, protocols, rules, and regulations. It seems like, and it's short-term money grab for long-term threat. It's a trade-off of the short versus long, because it's very easy to do these things better or right, where you say, these things can happen. We probably even benefit from this, right? Like in terms of just more interest, yada yada. But we're gonna put the firewalls in place to protect our leagues. To not have that is just, I think, it's gonna bite somebody on the behind at some point. Because there's obviously no rules and regulations. I mean, I don't remember personally, but I always think about. Now I can't think of his name off the top of my head, but the Detroit Lions offensive lineman who played Webster's dad on the
Alex
sitcom.
Karras.
Yeah, he got suspended for a year of his pro football career for having poker games on road games where they're basically betting for cigarettes, or pocket change.
Well, I mean, then of course the obvious is the greatest hitter in baseball history is not in the Hall of Fame because he bet on his own team, and Pete Rose. And again, that's the funny part. Is all of a sudden it's not a problem. All of a sudden we're going to build a team in Vegas, and we're going to be in bed with the Vegas casino owners, who are involved in the deal. We're going to have the most infamous gambler in NBA history, who is an owner, all of a sudden be on the board of a gambling company. It's just the concerns have completely and totally gone away. See, Mr. Lefty over here ought to be happy, because society turned like that. It's. I think there was always kind of a morality play with gambling. From certain aspects of society. Ooh, it's bad, and the innocent are going to be corrupted by this. I didn't necessarily go with that. I don't necessarily hold that view, but that was kind of the long-standing criticism of it, and that's just completely and totally gone. I just someday something's going to happen, and we're going to question. We the public are going to question the integrity of basketball even more than we are, and it's going to be because of one of these owners, whether it's Jordan or somebody else, is involved. It's going to happen. I bet my life on it. No, I wouldn't, but I'd bet something on it, which
Yeah,
is
no,
ironic.
I mean, I think it's inevitable. I mean, that's just anytime you bet on human nature making mistakes, you're not gonna go poor. Um, and as a tried and true lefty, I would argue that I am offended and shocked and worried about the lack of regulation, which is actually what's going on here, right? I had
As a
like
tried and true conservative, the word tons of government regulation
well,
just
I didn't say
rings
government
alarm
there.
bells in my head.
But I find it amazing that they're not policing themselves. And I just noticed as a sports consumer, uh, I have found it remarkable in the last, I'd say, year to 18 months. And then, especially, I think, even more so with the kickoff of the NFL in 2020, is the amount of how much sports betting has entered this the ecosystem of sports, right? So, it's everywhere. Sponsorships. I'm hearing podcasts that are dedicated to gambling, that are sponsored by sports books, the fantasy football leagues. You see like player stats sponsored by a sports book. You see Yahoo has put in within their software a direct way in which players can gamble on their individual games with another owner. Yes, I quickly challenged my week one opponent to a $5 bet. So I'm just amazed at how much integration there is around the business of gambling. That's basically right up there with Budweiser, Coke, Toyota, Chevrolet.
Yeah, and well, I remember the defunct Arena League was broadcasting gambling related data on their broadcast, and that is coming. Okay, the NBA, NFL, and the NBA will be doing that. I'd be willing to bet that too. I think at some point they're going to be in bed enough that we're going to see gambling related data running on a scroll on Fox, NBC, CBS, ESPN broadcast. And again, I just think it's interesting that all of a sudden nobody cares. All of a sudden, when there's so much money involved, the morality of it, and more importantly, the conflict of interest part of it, just all went out the window with a snap of a finger. All of a sudden, nobody cares, and the reason is there's so much money involved. I'll bring up the Dan Snyder Stadium hunt as an example of this. Okay, so as we follow the Washington football team here on this show. Obviously, both of us do. And Dan Snyder's hunting around for a stadium for several years, and nobody wants him, and for obvious reasons. But he went to the Maryland legislature and asked for a gambling permit, and told the Maryland legislature that he would build the stadium himself if they would give him a gambling license. So the idea here is he's going to build a casino next to the new Washington football stadium. You know, 20 years ago, that would have been unheard of. And now it's just accepted. And it wasn't a problem at all. I mean, it's not done, don't get me wrong. But that's just something we'd have never seen. But the allure of money is so strong. And it's going to change I guess my point is it changes the calculus of franchise valuation, income, because in case everybody doesn't realize this, the NFL is getting a cut of the proceeds from these daily fantasy sites, okay? They're getting money from this, and the pot's going to get bigger and bigger as the time goes on. So all of a sudden, who cares?
I have a couple of interesting points. One, it was probably about 5, 6 years ago. Like FanDuel and DraftKings just exploded. It was like that one fall where they suddenly like no one knew who they were. No one even really knew what daily fantasy was. People had been playing fantasy football for at that point 20, 30 years, and obviously rotisserie baseball goes back to the early '80s. But that this idea of daily fantasy popped up, and everyone's like, "Who are these DraftKings and these FanDuel? They're everywhere." Remember, it was just like you couldn't turn your head without seeing ads for them. And everyone laughed and said they're gonna, like they're gonna die off, and this is some big money grab. But turns back in hindsight, they were playing a long game because they didn't really care about daily fantasy. It was just their toehold here, so that when and they were making speculations and predictions that we were gonna get to where we are right now. They'd be well positioned to flip from selling daily fantasy to selling full on sportsbook options. So so they were like, let's be 4 or 5 years ahead. Establish our brand, establish our name, get a user base by people playing daily fantasy, which is even more like gambling than regular fantasy football, really. And we'll be ready when everything changes. And I'd argue in terms of the no one cares. No one really cared ever about this, except that the nanny state cared. And so as soon as
I don't agree with that.
well, I mean, but that's what happened. As soon as the nanny state got out of the way, and then everyone rushed in. So there obviously was at least a critical mass of not caring that once it became legal or moved from fully legal to illegal to pseudo illegal to legal, the audience was just the same.
Well, I think the concern was always the integrity of the game, and I guess my point is the money overruled the integrity of the game concerns. We may be saying the same thing.
Yeah, I'm
'Cause
just
I
saying.
think,
As soon as the government didn't care, that was the only blocker.
yeah, no, I agree with that, but I think the integrity of the game concern is still there. It's just the money part of it totally overruled it. That's my point.
Yeah, and the government got out of the way of caring about that. Said,
I don't
not
think
our
the
issue.
government should care. The government should care zero about what happens in professional sports. You know, I mean, seriously, unless there's an owner who's trying to kill somebody, or there's racketeering involved or something, Michael Corleone wants to buy a NFL team. The government needs to be involved 0% in any professional sports in any way.
I'm not.
Truly.
I'm not debating that either way. In fact, and that I'd actually probably tend to agree with you. My point is, they were obviously the only people that did care.
Yeah.
And so once they didn't care, no one else did. So
Well,
that,
so was
that
the,
was
well.
what
Let me
was
stop you
holding
right
it.
there, though. So, are you saying that the concerns of the integrity of the game were phony, or they just died because the allure of money was so strong? What are you saying?
I'm just saying that the government regulation and basically, keeping gambling illegal, as as the world was like 10 years ago, right? Where if you wanted to gamble, you either did it illegally or you got on a plane to Las Vegas or Atlantic City. And in fact, in Atlantic City, you could sports bets were illegal. So once the government decided that it was going to care significantly less, and it wasn't just overnight, it was drip, 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 and then it just sort of the lights went on.
Well, the light that went on was the Supreme Court case.
Yeah, but also you had seen slippage in those rules, whether it was the reservation casinos or other kind of like end around. So it had been happening. My point is, they were obviously the only entity that was blocking most people from not caring. And so once
Yeah.
they changed, then like the owners, they obviously were just waiting for the rules to change, and the only safeguard was government regulations on gambling. Once they got out of that business or Supreme Court ruling and so on and so forth, all those they were the lifeguard at that point. Lifeguard went home.
Yeah, I think we said all we're going to say on this, frankly, but I just think it's fascinating that nobody all of a sudden cares about the integrity of the game issue. That just completely went away. Just it's gone and nobody cares. And, especially coming from the league that had proven referee corruption, who's to say the referees aren't going to do that again? Are there protocols in place? I would assume the NBA probably has rules that say if you're a ref, you can't gamble or whatever. But I, it's just nobody cares anymore. Nobody cares.
Also, the league that had the most public perception that there was some thumb on the scale, which probably wasn't true, but like in terms of like the
Tim Donaghy
consciousness.
swears it is.
Yeah, but I'm saying even before that scandal broke, if you had asked anyone what league do you think is the most fixed of the four, the average sports fan would have been NBA.
I listened to part of a podcast just this week with two guys, and forgive me if I can't remember the source, so forgive me out there, I can't point to you, but Tim Donaghy was on with these two guys, and he alleged that the NBA has fix-it refs for the playoffs, and said that if they want to make sure that a series goes to 7 games, there was one particular ref that they made sure called game 6. And then he started going, then they talked about the stats. And the example was that Lakers Kings game from 20 years ago, about it. So, and again, Tim Donaghy has zero credibility whatsoever. So who knows? But that, like you said, those allegations have been around forever. And they're only going to get stronger. That's going to come up again. That's all my point is. That's going to come up again in force at some point in the future.
Well, what will happen is everyone will gorge. It's very American. People will gorge and gorge and gorge and gorge and gorge, and then get shocked when they have diabetes, and then we'll go through some giant, scandal. And how did this happen? Will happen. I mean, that will happen. Whether it happens, and it could happen in the next 3 months, it could happen in the next 3 years, it could happen in the next 13 years, but it will happen.
Yeah, it will. Yeah.
All right, let's move on. We are moving on to our next story. What the hell is our next story, Steve?
We're gonna do the
college
the
sports, one of our
OutKick.
favorite.
Yeah, college football.
Yes. So not necessarily my favorite source, but I have to say I found this article in OutKick immensely fascinating. Where basically it's just I think to use the author's own parlance, said that calling BS on this idea that the pandemic and financial crisis and yada yada is causing these colleges and universities to cut all the downstream sports. I think he described them well. The Olympic sports is a kind of a common way to understand this. And, so, we got to cut men's gymnastics. We got to cut field hockey. We got to, cut this, that, and the other thing. And the article makes the point that this is something that these colleges and universities wanted to do for a long time. And they're using the cover of night, so to speak, the cover of the pandemic, to do things they already wanted to do. And the idea that a rowing team or a gymnastics team or even a track and field team, were financial drains on the university was a fallacy. These are not costing these universities really a marginal amount. And so he just said basically that that's not true, and had some evidence to back it up. And what I found interesting was that he wasn't just complaining or calling out an issue. He had a pretty straightforward solution, which is stuff that we talked about in the show for a long time, which is you basically, and I think he drew the circle around men's football, men and women's basketball. You just make them basically College Sports Inc., I think he called it, and you basically just make that a business model with including paying players, including whatever it needs to make that a business subsidy of these university systems. And you firewall that off and you let that be what it is. And he even had a Title IX solution, which was that you could still have some stipulation that some percentage of, I think he said for football specifically, football profits would have to in some way be earmarked for a percentage to fund Title IX sports at universities to ensure compliance with that law. I was like, this is about as common sense solution to college sports as I've ever seen, although I've had the same idea.
Yeah, no. Okay, first of all, I am an acolyte in the Church of OutKick. I love OutKick. It's definitely my favorite radio show. The article is not written by Clay Travis. The article was written by Greg Couch, who I have never heard of. It's called NCAA Schools Cry Poverty, Use Pandemic to Cut Sports They Didn't Want. Anyway, I got to be honest. I mean, we've talked a lot about this on this show. I've never really thought about that perspective before I read this article. It's why I really want to bring it up. Do these schools really care about women's field hockey, or are they just doing it because the law makes them. And he's basically saying, the author of the article, Couch, is basically saying, yeah, they're just doing it because somebody's making them. That's sort of what they're getting at, and they're using the pandemic issue to claim poverty and get rid of these programs. Now part of the reason why football sucks up a lot of the money is that the coaching staff is so highly paid. You know, what does Nick Saban make? $15 million a year. I mean, I'm making that number up, but it's somewhere in that range. That could fund the entire season for the field hockey team and the swim team and whatever else for a year. So what Couch is sort of saying is, let's just stop the madness and stop pretending, call it pro sports, which again, you and I have said for a long time. And then, you can still, maximize the money and still kick some of the profits over to the amateur sports enough to kind of keep them afloat. It's not a bad solution, but it's a very cynical way of looking at college athletics. But, we're all about cynicism on this show.
Yeah,
it's like a guiding principle of what we do here, I think.
For sure. Although I even think you can read a slightly less cynical view of it and still hold the same ideas and facts. And I think ultimately, if you were to do something like this, it would alleviate some of the cynicism from the universities having these kind of Olympic sports athletic programs. I think if you separate these things out and make them not tied so inherently together, then these sports might, because they're not going to be big cash overlays, right? There is value. I mean, there is value to having these sports at these universities. Well-rounded student athletes. You're going to attract different kinds of students. There are real reasons you have these downstream athletic programs, and if you could separate these things out a little bit, it may actually take the cynicism out of having these athletic programs and bring them back more to the idea of the well-rounded university experience.
Well, yeah, I mean, what I've always kind of wanted on a macro level is, let's just stop pretending about football and basketball. Stop pretending. Call it what it is, which is a professional sport. And, I think women's basketball really isn't, I guess in the same category, but fine. Don't lump them into. But, yeah, I think it's better for everybody. Stop pretending it's not a professional sport. Maximize the income, and then sure, you can use the income to fund the rest of the athletic department still. But there's going to be a lot more money around. So it's not a bad solution. So congratulations to Greg Couch, whoever you are, Greg Couch, on a pretty bold take on the situation. Now, will they do this? It's tough to see. There's all sorts of problems in college sports right now. The Big Ten is still fighting. We did a story we've done 2 stories on this. The Big Ten is still fighting amongst themselves and with the parents and students, athletes involved, to maybe have a season and maybe not. And the latest, I guess, is that they are trying to look at having a November start to the Big Ten season. So the point is, there's a lot of problems in college football right now, and the pandemic has sort of not exacerbated them. It brought a lot of things to light, and the funding is one of them. The funding is definitely one of them. I also don't think it's a good thing that these schools are eliminating the minor sports. That is a key part of the collegiate experience for some is athletics. Okay, I think it's a good thing that you have amateur athletics, because that's a part of the development of young people is athletics. You learn a lot from being an athlete. Not all of us have the ability to be, an athlete in the college level, but for those who do, I think it's a good thing. It's just when you get it so far slanted the other way, like it is in football, where they're not even really students, it bothers me. And so my whole point with all of this has always been, just call King's X on it and just stop pretending that they're students and just make them pro athletes. Is my solution to it. And that's kind of what Greg Couch here is saying in the OutKick article. But this is truly a monumental day when I have Chris Larry, of all people, agreeing with OutKick the coverage. Or I guess OutKick is their new name. So much like occasionally I agree with your side of things, this is one time when you are agreeing with my side of things that makes me happy.
Yeah. Okay. Although it was not a political, it wasn't even an overtly political take.
Just let me have this moment, okay?
All right.
You're right, but let me have this moment.
Take your laugh.
Take my W. Yeah.
The one thing that I did think about that probably would be an intended consequence, I'm not quite sure, but one thing that would probably happen in this model is you'd see basically the elimination of football programs in Division 3, Division 1 AA. That maybe some version of that survives, but it's basically an admission that the only college football programs would be where it would fall in what we now would call Division 1, and maybe even some Division 1 programs actually would go away. But definitely, this model I think would be the end of things like Division 3 college football.
I don't know if I agree with that because they operate in a separate universe now anyway. Okay, they don't rely on TV revenue. It was barely on TV. The Division 3 games aren't even on anywhere, really.
Yeah, but
the Division 2...
Would you carry that cost if you can't get into that money? And I mean, would it be worth it for these smaller universities to invest in that at the expense of the rest of their athletic department?
And not have the bleed down of the excess funds, you're saying?
Yeah.
Some schools would probably go away, yeah. I don't think every one of them would, because some of them place a priority on it and have endowments and stuff, and some of them could probably keep it up. But it wouldn't be, I don't think it would be the death knell, but it would certainly change the calculus a little bit. I guess I'll say it like that. Especially at maybe the Division 3 level when there's so little, bleed down. Or so little other funding is what I'm saying.
Yeah, which in those programs are in jeopardy right now. So in a lot of situations.
But those are good things. See, those are true, pure amateur athletics, and I'm strongly in favor of pure amateur athletics. Because again, I think you have a 20-year-old or 19-year-old kid who's an athletic talent, and he learns how to operate within a team structure at a high level. Learns some leadership, learns discipline, all that. Those are all good things, and that's the true purpose of college athletics, the pure purpose of college athletics, in my view. And so I think to keep that up is something that we should strive for.
My brother-in-law is a small college athletic director, and he had a funny story one time where he was about to hire a football coach who was had an NFL assistant coaching experience, and he's basically kind of coercing the guy out of retirement to come coach his Division 3 team. Well, one of the people that he had worked for had been John Elway as a coach, and so he had to do a phone job reference for his new hire, and that was John Elway. So spent an hour on the phone doing a background check, reference check with John Elway, which I always thought was pretty funny.
John Elway is sort of the 7 degrees of John Elway when it comes to the NFL. I saw who's the NFL ref with the big guns, the huge arms?
Oh yeah, I know you're talking about. I don't remember his name. Yeah,
that guy. Yeah, he's a lawyer in Arizona, probably non-practicing now. But anyway, I was at a seminar where he spoke, and he didn't really have anything interesting to say legally at all. But he just went up there and told NFL stories. Which had nothing to do with, developing our legal education whatsoever. But he was kind of an arrogant jerk a little bit about it. But, he told a lot of, stories like, so I'm standing there talking to Elway, and this is what John said. And, but Elway came up multiple times. And so it's like all roads can somehow combine to John Elway. But, yeah, no, that's fascinating. And perhaps we ought to have a guest on the show someday, Chris, when we're talking about this. Hint, hint.
Yeah, he would probably do it. He's definitely having to deal with the ramifications of all of this in a small college athletics department. That is for sure.
I'd love to hear about his funding. I don't know if he'd be willing to talk about that on the air or not in a broad sense, but I think it would really be. I'd really like to know right from the belly of the beast where the money is coming and where the money is going at his level. That I think would be fascinating.
Yeah, he's an interesting guy in general because he started as basically a late teenager, early 20-something, working as an intern with Abe Pollin at the old Capitol Center. So he's got an interesting journey in sort of the outliers of sports, college and pro. We'll see how all this goes. I agree. I thought this was a fascinating solution. I appreciate articles where they actually say, how about this, rather than just constantly complaining about a problem. So just
That's
on,
not pop culture. The pop culture version of news today, though. Unfortunately.
yeah, I would agree with that. We're short on solutions on every front.
Yeah.
So we'll see. I mean, Steve and I have been banging this drum for a long time that something's going to change long before anyone knew how to spell COVID-19. So we'll see. Things like this just usually show where the fault lines are. They don't create them.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Well, one other. I mean, we're going to go into some real sports business nerd stuff and look at this. I don't know, brewing fight between WADA, such a funny acronym, and the U.S. government around doping. You want to give us the introduction?
Yeah. Okay. So, first of all, WADA is the World Anti-Doping Association agency, World Anti-Doping Agency, and the U.S. government has one. They have the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency, and two, surprise, surprise, the federal government is funding a significant portion of WADA to the tune of $414 million is what the government, U.S. government, is kicking in. So if you want to read about this, Front Office Sports has this story called U.S. Anti-Doping Head, WADA Threat to Athletes Over Funding Shameful, dated September 4th. That's the source for this. So the point here is that the U.S. government, specifically the executive branch, the Trump administration, is talking about chopping the funding to WADA from $414 million to $28 million. And so this has ticked WADA off. And so WADA has now threatened, I don't know if they're threatening, they have brought up the possibility of excluding United States athletes from international competition as a result of the U.S. threatening to pull funding. Now, the WADA rules don't account for this and don't allow for this, according to the head of the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency. So it's a funding fight. It should surprise nobody that the federal government's trying to cut funding from some international agency. The U.S. government's been doing that for the past 3 years, 3.5 years. That part isn't all that interesting, but the idea that WADA would, and even thinks they have the authority to do so, exclude athletes from the upcoming 2021 Olympics, for example, is kind of a big deal. I suspect it won't happen. Who knows about the funding? It might happen, but that's the fight. And the funding part doesn't surprise me at all. The threat doesn't surprise me at all. What will surprise me is something actually happens. But that's the issue.
Yeah, I
Thoughts?
this is saber rattling, basically. Probably on all sides, because eventually they'll probably come up with, I think they'll come something. There will be funding. It won't be nearly at that level, but it also won't be that deep a cut. So I think, this is what happens in negotiations and saber rattling. I think the more interesting part to me is just there's a pretty deep threat to how these international competitions are funded, organized, governed. This is another thing where the year delay of the Olympics is a big piece of this. How is that going to be survived? Who's going to pick up the costs? Are international sports in jeopardy? You already have the Russian team banned or whatever. I mean, this feels like a skirmish in what is a larger battlefield about how this whole system of international sports, which on almost every level the United States has propped up, whether it's by having the premier players or teams or leagues feed into it, the back to the U.S. university system, which I think we even mentioned a couple weeks ago, basically underwrites most international athletes, especially in the Americas, to continents. So, the United States undergirds most of this international ecosystem of international competition, or at least a giant segment of it. So, and who knows what survives of that? Who even knows what kind of interest there is? Who else is going to step up? And then you add in, the cost, the governance of and the keeping up with science around, doping, which is just kind of a broad word to describe many, many things. And that's another whole piece about how you actually even govern all of this. I think it's going to be a very interesting time to see how much of international sports, most exemplified but not exclusive to the Olympics, survives the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, yeah. WADA is not spending $414 million on sending a bunch of inspectors out to watch people pee. The money is spent in the laboratories trying to keep up with the doping and whatnot. I mean, from a macro level, I don't think the United States should actually have to fund this organization like we fund so many other organizations. I'm totally fine with pulling out of it. Yeah, there is kind of a macro level problem, I think, with the Olympics. It used to be an amateur thing, and it's not really an amateur thing anymore. Certainly the Eastern Bloc, the old Eastern Bloc countries, Russia and all that. I mean, they're basically running a government-run professionals operation, and they're paying their players to train. And that's really not the spirit and intent of the Olympics. The spirit and intent of the Olympics was true, sort of pure, non-political competition for the sake of competition. And that's just the farthest thing from the truth anymore. And this, like you said, is sort of the tip of the iceberg with this. There's so much money involved in the Olympics nowadays with the broadcast rights and ticketing and, the associated economic, fallout, to the local economies and the building the stadiums and all that stuff. And the drug part of it is just one thing. I think what I do like is having the idea of an international drug agency is not a bad idea. And I think the NFL would be wise to bow down to them too. I've always thought that's the solution to the problem in the NFL. Just whatever WADA tests for, sign up with them. Get the NFL totally out of the drug business completely. Just whatever's illegal for WADA, that's what we do. And so I've said that on this show. So I don't know what's going to happen for this fight. I would suspect you're right, Chris, in that there'll be some sort of funding cut in the middle, and this will probably go away. That would be I can't imagine that U.S. athletes would be banned. It took the Russian athletes to get banned. A systematic doping problem that was not only uncovered, but they were directly thumbing their nose at the International Olympic Committee by the government was running a cover-up, and it got exposed. That's why Russia, and even then, the Russian athletes are not completely banned. Some of them can compete.
Yeah, there's an end
will be there, just not under the flag of Russia. But don't think for a minute that the Russian government isn't running it all anyway.
Yeah, no. To get whatever version of banned is they currently have, which has all kinds of ways for certain athletes to still compete. We basically had athletes showing up with syringes in their arms. I mean, it was almost that blatant.
It was, and the Russian government was running the cover up. That was the thing. There's one thing to say, like there were rumors that back in the 80s that Carl Lewis was doping. I don't know if they were true or not true, but if he was, that's him and a supplier doing it, maybe a trainer. But what was different with the Russian thing is the Russian government was systematically running a program that got exposed and that they were lying about. That was the problem here, and that's why the Russians got in trouble. So the idea that WADA is going to try to exclude the American athletes from the Olympics over this, I think, is far-fetched and just, like you said, saber-rattling. That's it.
Yeah, it's bad for their bottom line. They need the U.S. teams competing and showing.
Because believe me, somebody's getting rich off this. Okay, the money from the U.S. government is giving is going into somebody's pocket. There's this is not an altruistic, hey, let's help the integrity of international competition. No, whoever's running WADA and the labs behind it and all that are making a lot of money, and they're protecting their financial interests. Period. Dot. The end.
You bring up an interesting point, though. I wonder, let's say the U.S. government reduces its funding to WADA by, down to a fourth of its regular historical contributions or whatever that is. Do you have, quote-unquote private industry, which is basically the big professional sports leagues, come in and fill that gap by signing on to their protocols and process? So it would take them It's almost like, instead of doing this in house, we're just gonna outsource this, and then that will make up some of the lost revenue for these kind of agencies and bodies to continue to exist and do their work.
Yeah, no, that's a possibility, and that's a way they could, because the NFL would have to pay them, for that to do it. And the reason why I was in favor in the case of the NFL is because it eliminates the controversy. The NFL and the Players Association would stop fighting about it because the agreement would be whatever they do is what we do, you know, and that eliminates all of the controversy in my eyes. But yeah, no, it's not up to WADA. Of course, it's up to the sports leagues to do it. You know, and certainly there's no altruistic interest in the NFL or the NBA in helping out the International Doping Agency. And in the case of the NFL, they just signed another 10-year CBA that governs drugs, so it's not going to happen. It's just me. This is just me babbling about it more than anything. But it's an interesting thought. Could WADA make a proposal and just say, look, we need the income and we'll do it for you for cheaper than what you're doing it now and less controversy, and maybe they sign off on it? Sure, I guess.
I like that. That's an interesting solution. The other thing I'll say, which is gonna put your hair on fire. I also see probably something similar to the gambling issue where everyone cared until they didn't on some versions of this doping. I think eventually there's gonna be calling uncle on some part of this that says, like, because it's not, we're not really talking about anabolic steroids like Lyle Matuzak or whatever might have died from, or that might have been popular in the 80s, or even the Bash Brothers versions of doping. We're talking about especially in Olympic athletes, we're talking about cutting edge science. And at some point, because it's going to be too expensive to police, it's too difficult to keep on top of, and there would be some real gray areas. What's the difference between LASIK surgery and some other kind of enhancement? I think at some point you're going to see not an elimination or like all performance enhancing things are legal, but there will be, over the next 10 to 15 years, a significant relaxation of what people consider quote unquote doping.
I hope not. You know how I feel about this. And there's two different. I mean, remember, first of all, I think it's funny you mixed up names. It's you mixed up doping. John Matuzak.
That's right. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
They were the same guy in my mind. They looked the same. They had the same crazy personality. They both played for the Raiders.
Yeah. It's just kind of funny. You were combining dope, steroid heads.
Yeah. They both died of it.
But okay, there's two different issues here. One is drugs of abuse, and then performance enhancing drugs.
Yeah, I'm only talking about the latter.
You're talking about the performance. Okay. I think that's an even bigger problem in sports, and I think there's ought to be a bigger incentive to keep that out. You can argue about the morality of the drugs of abuse and all that, and the truth of the matter is the NFL cares about drugs of abuse because they care about the perception of the public, and the perception of the public, contrary to my wishes, has changed, and that's why they were able to relax the marijuana policy, for example. Despite, again, against my best wishes, but I'm now in a minority, it looks like, on that issue. But performance-enhancing drugs can dramatically affect the sport. I don't know if I agree that the public is going to not care about having doped-up robots out there competing. At some level, there's always going to be a concern about that what you're not seeing is the pureness and it's going to call the integrity of the game into question. So I don't know if we're going to go that far down the road. I hope not, at least on the performance enhancing drug part.
And I'm not necessarily advocating for it.
I know what you're saying. You're just saying it's going to happen. I don't know if I'm going to agree with that because I think the public still sees it as a massive problem. They don't want a bunch of people with needles sticking out of their butts competing on the field.
Yes, they don't. Although you could make it. I mean, people have short memories too. They don't seem to care that much ultimately. I just think what science and then these governing bodies classify as performance enhancing and not is going to get more sophisticated or more open, and that will mean a third, I'm just making this up, but a third of the things that might be verboten now will be allowed. And I just think we're going to see some kind of trend that way. And it does become really hard to parse the difference between some kind of auctionating whatever of blood and LASIK surgery or elective Tommy John. Like those things become, even for scientists, like the differentiators of what is and isn't is not an easy question.
Well, yeah, I mean, and as to the LASIK point, who's to say that science will not come up with a way to dramatically improve vision someday? Who's to say you can't, if you have the right surgery, you can't have 10/10 vision instead of
Right.
20/20 vision? And I think that's your point. So then, does that become a quote performance enhancer or not? That's an interesting point, and it's a good question. I think the original concern with the performance enhancing drugs was the health aspect of it. I think they banned it originally because, especially the old anabolic steroids that I don't think many people take anymore, at least at the pro level, really were legitimately harmful. Now, you could make the argument that that's their problem, and as long as they jump into it knowingly, why do anybody care if John Matuzak wants to destroy his body, is that my problem? Probably not. And the libertarian leaning in me says, who cares? If he wants to do it, let him do it. You know, so that was the original part of it, and so I think you could distinguish between, say, having the eye surgery that I just made up that doesn't exist yet is different than shooting up anabolic steroids. And so one ought to be allowed and one didn't. And so I think what you're pointing here is the line can kind of get blurry as science and biology and medicine changes and improves in the coming years. Yeah, I agree with you. And then, so what do you classify as wrong and not wrong? I don't have an answer to that.
Yeah, they take a pretty broad brush right now, and I think
Yeah.
that'll be an interesting reckoning. I mean, it's the science is just advancing very very fast on a lot of these pieces. So it'll be interesting to see, and why you need some level of governance body to make these decisions. However it's
Yeah,
funded.
well, and the rule kind of, as if to put the rule in simple terms, the rule now basically is if you're taking something that elevates hormones or other aspects of your body above that which naturally occurs, it's banned. Okay, that's where kind of the line is, and so you can buy a lot of these like powders and stuff in GNC that are illegal under the NFL collective bargaining agreement and illegal under the international drug rules because they are elevating certain things in your body above which it naturally occurs. That's the line right now, and so you could keep that line in place and say, whatever the medical advancement that happens, if it's artificially changing your body, then no. I mean, you could kind of keep that in place, but determining whether that's true or not becomes a bigger question.
Yeah, no, it's gonna be fascinating. So we'll see how that goes, and I'm sure, especially now that we're in an Olympic year, the next 12-ish months probably bring new light and controversies and things around the story because it always does. Whether it's people getting banned or new doping methods that are discovered, et cetera, et cetera. So there'll be new updates on this story from lots of angles for sure. But that brings us to the close of this edition of It's Just Business. Steve, I know this is not our normal domain, and people will know the answer to this by the time they listen, but are you in the prediction game for this week's Eagles Washington football team
Well,
match?
yeah. Yeah, my season predictions are in writing on the Hogsty website under the 2020 season prediction tab, and we did our last week's show. We did our season prediction. So I predicted a Philadelphia Eagles win. I think I said maybe 28-17 was my prediction.
I haven't gone as far as to have a score, but I think,
We always do that on the
yeah,
Hogsty.
yeah,
We try to guess the score.
but I think a Tuesday narrative of after the first week of the NFL is going to be Ron Rivera and Washington football team come out with a shocking victory of the Eagles. I think they're going to punch the Eagles in the mouth.
You realize they haven't beaten the Eagles in 3 years, right?
Yeah, the six straight. Which law of averages is say that's bound to even out at some
At
point.
some point, it's going to end.
That's right.
Let's hope.
I think they're going to catch him.
I'm not getting suckered into it anymore, Chris.
Oh,
I'm not getting suckered into this.
Yeah, I only usually hold this level of delusion for week one, but I like I like to keep the fantasy week one.
I predicted Redskins victories in week one too many times, and I can't do it anymore.
But even my analytical mind says I think they might catch the Eagles here.
Well, the Eagles' offensive line is their big problem.
They have injuries, yeah.
It's not just they have injuries; they've been devastated by injuries.
Yeah.
3 out of their 5 starters are out, and so if you buy into the church of Chase Young, which I've been a bit skeptical of it just because the hype is so high on him. But they ought to be able to get to Carson Wentz.
I think if you take Chase Young out of it, they still have a pretty darn good defensive line. I think Montez Sweat's going to take a jump or whatever. So it'll be interesting. I am interested in that matchup.
Yeah, we'll see. And it's we're talking about something that has already happened.
Yeah,
for those of you listening. So
so you can judge us on that.
Exactly.
All right. Well, we will see you in 2 weeks.